Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's TechStrong Learning Experience brought to you by Fairwinds. My name is Jared Harris, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Before we get going, I do have a few housekeeping notes that I'd like to share with you. Today's program is being recorded. If you miss any of today's discussion, or if you want to share it with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available to you shortly after we conclude today's program. If you have any questions or want to use the chat, please use the Q&A and the chat tab on the right side of your screen. You can let us know where you're signing in from. Just share some thoughts. Give us any questions that you've got. Just help keep the flow of the conversation going. We do have a few polls coming up here in just a few minutes after we get started, so please stick around. We want to hear your answers on those. And finally, at the end of today's program, I will have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around for the duration of the program so you can find out if you're one of the winners. Let's go ahead and kick off today's program. Ask us anything with the pitfalls and success of Kubernetes. Today, we're joined with Andy Suderman, the CTO of Fairwinds, Stevie Caldwell, tech lead at Fairwinds, Danielle Cook, the co-chair and the VP of marketing at Fairwinds. We've also got Flynn. He is a technical evangelist at Buoyant. And let's see. I will go ahead and turn the program over to the four of you. I think, Danielle, you're taking it from here.
I am. So welcome, everyone. Happy to have you all here. We barely have any slides because we're here to have you ask us anything. But, we are here. A lot of us are from Fairwinds, but we also have Flynn from Buoyant, as he said. And we're here to talk about anything you want to around Kubernetes. Now, we do have some questions in the background, but we hope that you brought your questions because we have been working with Kubernetes for years. Andy, Stevie, and Flynn have managed Kubernetes, have worked with it. They know it in and out. So lots of good questions. So with that, we're going to actually have them introduce themselves. But what is very important on here is I would like you to introduce yourself, and I want you to say the most memorable mistake you've made when starting with Kubernetes. So that's great. Andy, you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. So I'm Andy. I'm the CTO of Fairwinds. Actually, my story is going to be about what sort of got me moving towards Kubernetes. So back in the days of the data center and physical machines, we had 250 physical machines in a data center. We managed them all with like tmux sessions and SSH, and it was really horrible. But we also had Puppet. And we tried to make Puppet work. And so we had Puppet and Foreman. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a system for orchestrating Puppet across a bunch of different machines. Well, we had this Puppet server, and it was sort of this artisanally crafted machine that ran our Puppet and Foreman. And one evening, late at night, as I was working late, which I should not have been, I errantly typed a DD command, and I destroyed that entire server. Just pour it to the ground. And that is the biggest mistake I've ever made.
We've all done that too. That's right. The depressing thing.
Yeah. And so that's what led me into the world of containerizing and building things more resiliently so that, we could stand that server back up again and not be in the mess that I created from just DDing our entire performance server. So that's my story.
Amazing. All right, Flynn, over to you. Who are you and what's the biggest mistake you've made?
I'm Flynn. I'm a tech evangelist with Buoyant. I have actually been working in computing for 40 years. So yeah, I've made pretty much all the mistakes that it's possible to make. Andy, your story really resonates because I've done just about the same thing on occasion. My worst Kubernetes story, though, I think would be the one where, to set the stage for this was when I was working as, a hands-on engineer. And one of the things that we did a lot kind of to Andy's point about instead of having all the physical machines, you containerize, you get things so that you can just throw them away and get new ones all the time. And so I was working with something like 2 or 3 separate clusters for various different tests. And then a coworker of mine asked if I could take a look at something on my coworker's cluster. And I went, oh yeah, no problem. We went over, we looked at it, everything was great, got that problem sorted out, went back to my cluster, went through and went, oh man, this is just totally screwed up. Blew the whole setup away, and then realized I'd picked the wrong shell window. So I'd actually just been my coworker's cluster, not my cluster.
I bet he was your favorite colleague. He was so happy with you.
Apologized profusely, got everything stood back up again, got called off to do something else, came back to it, and did the same thing again. Half an hour later. So that would be one of those points where you kind of find yourself going, not only do you want fungible clusters, maybe a little focus and, a little actual access control is a good thing. Yeah. Doing it all by hand can get you in a lot of trouble sometimes.
Nice. All
I
right.
still talk to that coworker though. So, yeah.
Oh, that's a surprise. All right, Stevie, over to you.
So my name is Stevie Caldwell. I'm a tech lead at Fairwinds. I've been working in the tech space for a long time, but only within Kubernetes for like the last 5 or so years. So my stories are not going to be as interesting as Andy's or Flynn's, so my story isn't directly.
That might be a good thing.
It's not super Kubernetes related. It just so happened that the application was running in a Kubernetes cluster. It was my first job as an SRE working with Kubernetes, and it was for a company that had a mobile application. And they were using AWS certs, which I was, and they were using, so they're using ACM, and you get the little notification that your cert is going to expire, renew it. Would have done it a bunch of different times. So I just hit renew, and little did I know that they were actually pinning the mobile app on that cert. So it rotated everything. And so suddenly the key in that app was no longer functional, and the app just fell over. And I remember I was working from home that day, and I got a frantic call from the CTO, like, what did you do? And I was like, I renewed some certs like I normally do. And he was like, that's not the kind of thing. I was like, I asked over Slack, you guys cool with me renewing this cert? And no one responded. So I was like, I guess so. It's not important. And he's like, that's not the kind of thing we do over Slack. I was like, renewing a cert? Like, so that was a frantic call to AWS, who were able to help us out. But we, had to send out some emergency pushes for that app. And so I essentially took down our entire mobile application by renewing a cert.
That's pretty amazing.
There's a common thread here, right? I did something totally normal, except for the fact that this tiny other thing I didn't follow caused the world to come to an end.
That's right. That's right.
All right, so we're going to do just a quick poll for all of you who are joining and really loving where you're telling us. So Jared, you're going to start up the polling question, and it is, how much of your infrastructure is on Kubernetes or planned to be migrated in the next 6 months? So this is just helpful so that we make sure when we're answering questions that you might have, we're targeting them at the right place. All of them.
That's
nice.
me.
Wow.
I answered. I know I'm not supposed to, but I did.
Well, this is going
I
to be
answered.
good. Okay. All right.
That's not true. But
so as a reminder, ask us anything. If you have questions along the way, please jump in, ask us. It can be completely off the topic that we are asking, but that's what we're here to do. So, but I'm going to throw out a question for, and we don't actually have a lot of newbies here, obviously, if most people applications are in Kubernetes, or I guess if a lot of them are migrating, they still could be newbies. So when you're talking about moving an application, new thing to Kubernetes, like what's your first recommendation that you make? Who wants to go first on this? Flynn, you want to go first this time?
Obviously, the first recommendation we make is you should run Linkerd. All right, maybe. Yes, I am from Buoyant. We created Linkerd. We like it when people run Linkerd. No, actually, the first recommendation that I tend to make is probably along the lines of, hey, recognize that some of the documentation for people who are just getting started is very iffy, and you really need to go and talk to some people who've done this before and start learning some of the gotchas, things like that. The second recommendation I probably make actually these days is along the lines of, you are going to have to think about the ingress problem, and you are going to have to think about security within your cluster as well, and observability. And both of these can be harder than you expect. So go in and look into the tools that are available for that. Definitely don't try to go and do all of that on your own. Yeah.
Nice. Thoughts on that, Stevie, Andy? Additional recommendations?
I mean, I agree with those initial recommendations. I think for someone who's like brand new to Kubernetes, I would say get a firm understanding of containers in general, how they work, the underlying stuff about it, because I feel like the danger a lot of times with abstraction is that it leaves you vulnerable to when things go wrong and not understanding why things are going wrong. And things do go wrong, like what do
Always.
you do when right? What do you do when you see something's killed and you're like, I kind of understand what that means, but like in this context, it doesn't mean the same thing as what, So I would definitely sharpen up on just general containerization basics, namespaces and things like that, C groups and all that jazz. And also don't run anything sort of out of the box, right? There's a lot of stuff out there that's like, deploy your app in 5 minutes, spin up a cluster in 10 minutes, and you're good to go. Don't trust that. Do that.
We've definitely published that exact blog article before, I'm sure.
Everyone has. Everyone has, but it's a lie.
Okay. So to follow up on that, though, do you have a favorite set of resources for learning about containerization and all of that? And this is part of the reason I ask this, is that I have yet to find a really, really good 101 entry to a bunch of these things for Kubernetes. We're working on it, but
right.
Yeah.
I source a lot of resources. Honestly, I'm all over the place. I have several subscriptions to several like academy type things, right? So, I LearnCase.io still teaches me things to this day, and does some really good low level information about stuff. YouTube is a huge a resource for things like Containers from the Couch. A bunch of these like really established or established channels that really dive deep into that stuff. And then when everything else fails, like pay a little bit of money for the course, I know, but it's super worth it. Like go with a trusted resource, and there's a lot of them out there, and pay for the course.
Yep.
All right. Anything, Andy, that you want to wrap up on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that Flynn said was about, finding people that know it. Get professional help. And I say that, tongue in cheek, but there are lots of experts out there that, offer services or have materials like Steve was talking about, but there are lots of people out there these days. It's been around long enough. It's not like the early days where it was like, there's nowhere to go except directly to the source to find out how this thing's working. There's lots of resources out there. Try and find them. And if, you have the budget for it, hire a company like Fairwinds to run your clusters for you, because we just make it all easy. I have to throw a shameless plug in. So.
Well, yeah, don't worry. Minor comment. I would actually add to that, to what you just said, that if at any point you find yourself looking at the Kubernetes source in the first 3-4 years you are working with Kubernetes, you should possibly be reevaluating your life choices. Not Not because I think you should be afraid to look at open source projects, but because unless your goal is to go in and learn how to contribute to Kubernetes, you are probably running Kubernetes because there's something you want to accomplish with it, as opposed to wanting to just say, hey, I'm running Kubernetes. And if your goal is to accomplish something with the platform, no, don't go and look at the source code. Look at it from the perspective of a user and figure out how that stuff works.
Yeah.
Cool. So one of the things that I find is that every resource that I go to read, the first line of a blog of any content is Kubernetes is complicated, which I was coming to Kubernetes, I'd be like, if it's so complicated, why am I going to do this? So I want to throw that out to all of you. Like, is it complicated? And if it is, how do you avoid overcomplicating it? So Andy, why don't you go first this time?
I mean, if you look at it as a whole, yes, it's massive. It's complicated. It's powerful. There's 1,000 knobs everywhere. And these days there's like 1 million open source and paid projects that work with Kubernetes, alongside Kubernetes, on top of Kubernetes, underneath Kubernetes. Like, yes, it's a massive ecosystem, but there's a lot more resources for like the happy path than there were even just a couple of years ago. The managed service offerings are getting a lot better. There's a lot more functionality built into them that you don't have to do yourself. There's a ton of great resources now. So it's complicated, but there are more straightforward paths through it than there used to be.
Mm-hmm. Stevie, thoughts?
Heck yes, it's complicated.
But how do you really feel, Stevie?
I mean, honestly, like when I stop and think about every now and then, because we take a lot of this stuff for granted. When I stop and think about all the stuff that is going on under the hood, all the things the API server is doing, all the controllers that are running that are like doing this stuff, like, so quickly. It's like really, it's really kind of overwhelming. Like it's a super complicated under the hood. And then on top, like, again, we sort of cavalierly say, yeah, containerize your app and throw it into a deployment and voila. But there's a lot of stuff to like think about to get your stuff running in a cluster reliably and securely and, safely and all that stuff. And putting those things together can be pretty complicated, like figuring out resources what kind of resources you need, figuring out how to expose your application properly, figuring out the security things that you need to set. All that stuff, it is very complicated. So yes, it is.
Flynn, I feel like you're going to agree with this one.
I think Kubernetes, I think we need to draw a distinction between complicated for the people who are working on it and complicated for the people who are trying to use it. And I kind of feel, I completely agree that it's complicated for people who are trying to work on it and, write new pieces of Kubernetes and things like that, right? The Linkerd authors would love to talk to you about the complexity of Kubernetes networking stack, for example. I kind of feel like we as an industry are not putting enough effort into making it less complicated for people to use it. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of ways in which, and obviously I'm biased here, right? I got into the cloud native thing as the original author of Emissary, which is entirely about, hey, you're an application developer. This is your first time coming into Kubernetes. What's the one thing that you have to do to get started is solving the English problem. And so we tried to make that easy. And, it's still true that as an application developer, I feel like you really ought to be able to bake an app into a container fairly easily, solve the English problem, and get rolling. And a lot of the stuff out there tends to talk about that as much more complex than it needs to be. Likewise, you really should not have to go and have somebody on staff to run a service mesh for, a 4-person startup. You should just be able to install that, let it work, get some benefit from it. And once again, I'm biased. That's a shameless plug for Linkerd because it is actually simple enough to do that, which is one of the reasons why I'm at Buoyant. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think that there's a lot of room for us to make it much simpler to use Kubernetes, while still acknowledging that making something easy to use does not mean that you have to make it simple for the people working on it.
Yeah,
That also kind of gets into one of these questions about managed Kubernetes offerings versus Red Hat OpenShift and things like that. And
where I'm going, and I'm gonna see what happens when I hit this publish button. Does it show up?
ooh,
Don't know. Don't know what happened to it. So yeah.
there's a published thing on the Q&A tab. There we go.
Are managed Kubernetes offerings a favorite now, or full infrastructure as a service offerings like Red Hat OpenShift still prevalent? What decisions would weigh one over the other? Anyone want to take that?
I'm going to point that one at Andy, because from most of my perspective, I've tried really, really hard to be agnostic to the particular way in which you're running Kubernetes.
I mean, we try to do the same as well, but we have played in all the sandboxes, you know, running services for our customers. And, you know, we've always been big fans of GKE because they have generally, you know, newer features faster because they wrote the dang thing in the first place. That has sort of equalized over time. And it's really not the case. I think really when I'm weighing between cloud providers, it's not the Kubernetes offering that differentiates them anymore. They're all Kubernetes and they're all relatively good enough. It's now the ecosystem that you want to be in. What other cloud services do you need in your environment? Because Kubernetes isn't the only thing that you need necessarily. You know, maybe we'll get down the rabbit hole of databases and Kubernetes today, but you know, there's lots of other things around Kubernetes that you're going to need out of your cloud provider. You know, if you're a .NET shop that has an Active Directory set up already, maybe you should go to Azure because you can port all that over and take it with you, and it's going to integrate more seamlessly. Is that my favorite choice? No, I haven't been an AAD administrator in years, and I'm not a huge fan of it anymore because I don't do it. But there's value there, and maybe that's the ecosystem that you're playing in. You know, same with OpenShift and Red Hat. Like, are you in the Red Hat ecosystem? Is that something that you are familiar with and use? Then maybe OpenShift is a great place for you to be. Again, not my personal cup of tea, but that's not where my experience lies. So,
cool.
Let's also acknowledge that some of it also is going to turn into, who does your company already have a relationship with so you can get free credits to run your stuff?
Exactly.
You know, if you've got $1 million in AWS credits, and it would be really tough for me to argue that you shouldn't be using Amazon as a cloud provider, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to throw in a question around, so when we were talking about, is it complicated? And Stevie said, heck yes. You know, what
she ain't wrong.
Heck yes.
Yeah. So there's so many things you need to configure in Kubernetes and make the right choices and make sure it's set. But like, it's, you know, you have containerized workloads, they're spun up, they're spun, you know, they're killed, all of that. So how do you make sure that it's configured right? And how do you stay on top of doing that? Anyone? Andy, you're smiling.
I have an answer that's going to sound really snide, but
throw it out there. I love snide.
I'm trying to think if there's any way I can make this sound less snide. No, not really. My answer is don't. If you're coming at this from an application developer's perspective, pick a cloud provider that works for you and use it. Do not get into the massive tangle of weeds that is trying to go off and be a Kubernetes infrastructure manager on your first day. Just don't. Weirdly, I think that can get people much, much further than they often think it does. Sorry, yeah. Andy, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I think the question's more like, you know, I agree with you totally. Like, don't run Kubernetes yourself. Use the cloud provider for actually how you're running Kubernetes itself. But how are you using Kubernetes, deploying into Kubernetes, like how are you configuring your deployments and the things that you're installing in Kubernetes is a much bigger problem because the defaults are
bizarre.
yeah, not amazing. So that's where that's where my head was going with the question. So.
Yeah, and some of that to me is, there are tools like the whole GitOps thing where you can go and pick other people's brains and rely on some of that. There's a lot of value in kind of standardizing across your group of people and saying, hey, this is the way we think is sane to do it. There's an enormous amount of value in try it and find out what happens. Ideally, maybe not with your whole production workload, but if you can respond quickly enough, great. We all know that testing in prod is the new black. But I'm not sure it's possible to answer that prescriptively without getting experience working with the platform for your particular workloads.
Okay. So that kind of all of that conversation, we do have a question that I'll come to on monitoring in a second. But first I want to ask, so if lots of the people on this that responded to our poll said they're either using Kubernetes or they're migrating their apps in the next 6 months. So what are the things you need to think about when you are migrating apps? So Stevie, you talked about make sure you understand containerization, but what else beyond that?
I think the concepts of being able to run multiple, replicas, right? Some people forget that is one of the big things about Kubernetes is running a certain, running and being able to scale those replicas up as, you have traffic. And we've seen people in our work at Fairwinds who struggle with this. Either the app isn't configured to begin with to run in parallel, right? Or when they do run them in parallel, there's a whole thing about, how many of these do you think you could do without? If so setting pod disruption budgets and things like that. And how do you want to scale your workloads up as you have traffic fluctuate, and setting your HPAs and things like that. So I think that you want to think about how you're going to handle load with your application. You're going to want to think about what kind of load you expect, how, which metrics you care about in terms of determining your load. And then how you want to scale and what kind of resources your workloads are going to need. I feel like there's a lot of stuff inside in the details of your workload itself that you need to consider when you're deploying to Kubernetes.
How about the concept of a disruption budget and pod anti-affinity and that sort of stuff, right?
Right. Yeah.
Those were figuring out
spread constraints now, but yes.
That's right.
Yeah. But actually, that's a good point, right? When I first showed up with this and people were talking about anti-affinity stuff, it was like, what? What are you talking about? And trying to find something that talked about that concept was relevant and important, especially because as an application developer, you're much more likely to be thinking in terms of pods, whereas a Kubernetes cluster admin may very well be thinking in terms of nodes naturally, right? But the app developers tend to not to. So finding out places where they really talked about those concepts was useful. Another one that I remember being extremely confusing at first when I was trying to take some stuff that wasn't running in Kube and get it running in Kube was, I guess the right way to put it is the manner in which label selectors work between services, pods, and deployments. I guess I should really be saying services, deployments, and pods. And I didn't fully start understanding that one until I deleted a deployment and it took down half a dozen pods that it wasn't supposed to because I had label selectors that accidentally crossed deployment boundaries.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That was another one for candidates for Kubernetes mistakes, but it just wasn't on the same scale as blowing away somebody else's cluster. So
Yeah, understanding the relationships between the different objects and the paths that things take. It's just starting to shift your mindset into a distributed environment from a non-distributed environment, and understanding the mechanisms there it's a big ask, but it's important.
You just reminded me of another one, actually.
Another mistake or another?
No, another important thing with respect to moving things to run them, right? A lot of cases in which people are porting a non-cloud application to run in the cloud, they're also starting with a monolith and then breaking it up. And if you read a bunch of things, people do not often admit that when you do that, you're changing your monolithic application into a distributed application, and you have to worry about everything that goes with distributed applications. People like to talk about this as if somehow Kubernetes makes this a non-issue. No, it doesn't. You still have to worry about all that stuff. So, bad news on that one.
Yeah, that is probably one of the larger mistakes I think that people make, is like not understanding that application architecture is the first important thing to think about before where you're running that application. Like the application architecture informs where it should be running, and not the other way around. Honestly, unless you are like, I'm going to run Kubernetes and I'm designing a new application, now you can do your application architecture with Kubernetes in mind. But if you're taking an existing application, how's it built? And I think this, you've all alluded to this in some way or another in the conversation here. So it's important.
Yep.
Well, we do have some questions from our audience, if you will. One of the questions, Andy, I'll throw this one to you, are what are good monitoring tools for Kubernetes?
Oh, bother. There's a lot. There's a lot of great tools out there. We use Datadog quite a lot in-house. We're big fans of it, but their pricing model is
interesting.
To be honest, it's interesting. It's cryptic, and it can be very expensive very quickly if you're not careful. So like, it's a great product, but you have to be cognizant of the cost there. You can do a lot of great things with the Prometheus stack, but then your cost comes from a different place, and it's in, building it, designing it, maintaining it yourself. There's a lot of good materials out there, but that's the cost of running open source. We do both of those things in-house. And I know Linkerd plays very nicely with both of them. So I'll help.
See, I didn't even have to do the shameless plug there. Thank you. I appreciate that.
We're big fans of Linkerd, and not the other one that I won't mention. But yeah, so those are the two big solutions in my mind. But there's all the big players have Kubernetes offerings these days, and I've heard good things about many of them. So
okay,
there are no other service meshes, Andy. It's just Linkerd.
Right. Okay.
But both to put in my shameless plug and to speak a little bit to what Andy is getting at there, if you're talking about monitoring, then the stack is one thing, but an entirely different thing is that the stack can't monitor anything that the metrics don't go in for. So if you are trying to get good observability, you actually need to have good metrics feeding into the stack. And that is a real strength of service meshes, including Linkerd, because they are in a position to monitor all of the network traffic happening in your cluster. And so they can give you really, really good observability metrics all the way up and down your call graph effectively for free. The application developer doesn't have to do anything to get that. There's a demo that I did with Daniel Bryant of Ambassador Labs at KubeCon Detroit, I think Detroit, where we were talking about resilience. That used a demo application that I wrote that consisted of 3 services that were being used, on a regular basis, plus a 4th one to hand over the GUI. And I wrote all 3 of them. I did the whole thing top to bottom, and I had to use every single observability tool that I had to get that demo working correctly. Even as simple as just being 3 workloads where one person understood every single thing about them. So yeah, don't underestimate the value of the observability stack. It's really important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have 2 questions, but this one's a big question. So first of all, excellent answers. As a follow-up, 2 questions. If we go with Azure AKS, as we are an Azure shop on the digital side, Would a CKD certification be more appropriate for me? I'm a DevOps engineer to start with to help developers to adopt to the transition from a monolith to microservices-based architecture.
That's a lovely question. I don't know enough about Azure or that certification to really answer that.
Does anybody here have a CCAD? I think Stevie might.
I have just a CKA. I don't have the CCAD. I did, just for giggles, do the video course for the CCAD, which is, I can answer in the chat to the other question about where to recommend or study. But I'm not sure that you really need to get a CCAD to really help your developers. So the CCAD course is a lot about the other side of things. So we were talking about things like pod disruption budgets and HPAs and the different security contexts that you can set in your deployments and stuff like that. And you will get that information in there. So I suppose if what you are trying to do is, eat 2 donuts with one hand, and you're trying to both get your certification as animal friendly, Andy, and and be able to help your developers, a CCAD is probably the way to go. The CKA really focuses more on the infrastructure side of Kubernetes, so it's more about the stuff we were talking about, deploying nodes and the different components and stuff like that. And then the actual workload stuff is more focused, is approached more in the CCAD. So I guess to basically answer your question, sure, the CCAD over the CKA. Yeah, I just went full circle there. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to park the second half of this question because I feel like when we ask the database question, it's going to blow up. But I want to talk a second about helping developers. So one thing at Fairwinds that we talk a lot about is that you're going to create a platform for your developers to use to deploy their applications. And so you're building it on Kubernetes, but you have to give them the tools that they need to basically ensure that you're using Kubernetes securely. It's cost effective, it's reliable, because it's all about making sure they're configuring properly. So do we want to talk about developer enablement from that perspective for a minute? Maybe Andy, you want to throw in some thoughts on things you should do to make sure your developers love the Kubernetes platform that you're building?
This is a topic I've talked about a lot lately. And now it's time for my shameless plug. So this is what we try to do with Fairwinds Insights, and we provide to our customers. And so it's really, in my opinion, building a good platform is about 2 things. It's about putting in guardrails up front in order to make sure that we're doing things correctly the first time. So it's, proper configuration, admission control, feedback into your CI/CD system so that we say, hey, this is where you're doing it wrong. But then it's on the other side of that, it's providing good documentation and patterns for developers up front. So we're working on things like templates and Helm starters that you can use that are standard for your company, or just good documentation internally about this is how we use Kubernetes here and the things that you're going to have to do to deploy your app. And so really education and then guardrails that enforce those best practices are kind of the 2 main pillars of how we're enabling developers in our services and with our software.
Awesome. Anything to add on that one before we open the can of database questions? All right.
Can of database worms. I actually guess I would add one other thing to the developer experience, which is that there's a principle that we talk about every so often across a couple of different places I've worked that is summarized as the principle of least surprise. If you can arrange your platform and arrange your development environment such that a developer who does something, whatever it is that they do, if they do something and they get a not surprising response, they will tend to feel better about that than if they do something and get something completely unpredictable to them. And a lot of this really gets more into things like API design or, how you structure programs internally. But some of it does get into things like, there are ways that you can deploy Kubernetes and have some very unpredictable behaviors because you've done a bunch of funky things under the hood. And you may very well find that it's better to keep it simple. And it's certainly better to keep it predictable than to try to do a bunch of ludicrously fancy stuff until people are used to it.
Cool. All right. So part 2 of this question. Do microservices necessarily need to have their own databases, or can we use microservices for our front end and API layers alone, consuming data from an Oracle backend, which is our ultimate, I don't know, SOR? I'm not sure how to.
Reason.
Source of record?
Source of record's probably right.
I went source of record, yeah.
Yeah. I think there's actually a lot of great examples of cases where microservices are stateless, where the databases are very, very much separate from the microservices, and you have many, many more microservices than you do databases or tables. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I actually can think of a pretty large stack of applications that use microservices for the front end and API layers, and then have something else that's the one place that things are stored. Some of that also gets into where do you put the databases, because life can be fascinating when you're talking about running databases in the Kubernetes cluster.
Thoughts? Andy?
I've seen both work. It's an application architecture question, and that's always going to be specific to what your application is doing. And so it's hard to answer that with a blanket statement. Both can work. It just depends on what those services are doing, and what they need. I've definitely seen and done both. So.
All right. So we did have a question, and I'm going to kind of tweak the participant's question a bit. So the question is, where can I find the best information on securing Kubernetes clusters? But I think I think we should answer that, but also talk a little bit about, is Kubernetes secure? Stevie, you want to take this one? You want to make sure everyone gets to start, and then we get to critique your answers,
Oh, awesome. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Where do you find the best information on securing Kubernetes clusters? Well, there's the Kubernetes website, which has a lot of stuff. There are blogs, which have a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. That's a really hard one for me to answer, because you just start, combing the internet, and you'll stumble across so many blog posts about securing Kubernetes, and so many different takes on what it means to secure Kubernetes. And so I don't know how to answer that part of the question, more than just like the internet, people docs, I don't know, our stuff. We got some good stuff in Insights. I'm really bombing this portion.
No, I think what we can do though is talk about, is it secure overall? So,
I don't. Well, so I would say not out of the box, but there's also a lot that decisions that you make when you're deploying it that determine whether or not it's secure. So a lot of that's in your hands. You can. There are some defaults, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. There are some defaults that I've looked at and been like, why would this be the default thing that you set? And I wish I could remember one of the things that I came across that I was like, that doesn't make any sense if that's the default. It's really, I think, no, I wouldn't say just deploy Kubernetes and then deploy your stuff to the cluster and voila, you're good to go. You have to put some thought into it. There are lots of ways that Kubernetes will allow you to really foot gun yourself. And so yeah, you have to put some effort into it, efforts into securing your workload. You have to make the decisions about where your API server sits, where your API endpoint sits, whether it's private or public, how you give people access to those clusters. Some ways I think are more secure than others. Specifically, don't use the CSV, file method. I don't think that's the very first one they teach you, the basic auth. Put the CSV file on your control plane nodes. I wouldn't necessarily go that way. There are things about securing your network policies, so that if you do have something happen, you at least control your blast radius. There's stuff about RBAC policies, things about least privilege with permissions and cluster roles and cluster role bindings, all that stuff. There's a lot of stuff that Kubernetes makes available for you to use to secure, but out of the box, I'd say it's not any more secure than just basically it locks the front door for you. Maybe. You could deploy it without locking the front door, but at the very least, I think that's the lowest entry point for security when you deploy a cluster right off bat. It's just at least the front door, you can have that locked. But once you get inside, Kubernetes kind of makes it easy for you to just rummage around all the rooms and go through grandma's jewelry drawer and stuff like that. So
Nice.
There.
Amazing.
Insane.
Love a good metaphor.
Do you want to have any comments around Kubernetes security?
I think I cleverly just posted a blog post in the wrong place. Awesome. Well, who knows? Maybe I'll be able to find that later. But I feel like one of the other relevant questions is, and I kind of hate to phrase it this way again, but what are we talking about when we say security? Because we could be talking about, so does your cluster automatically prevent people on the internet from reaching into it and poking around? Well, yeah, most of the ones from cloud providers tend to do that. The ones from cloud providers tend to at least sort of provide some sort of authentication and authorization for people who are trying to manipulate the Kubernetes API itself. They really don't do very much for securing network communications in your cluster. Shameless plug, you run a service mesh like Linkerd. They don't do anything at all for authentication and authorization at a higher level, is the user using your application able to use this particular microservice and not this other one, things like that. So security can mean lots of different things, and it's important to figure out which one we're talking about. Post I was trying to publish in here.
I put it in the chat for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Where did it go in the first place?
You posted it as a question, so I've also published the question, so it's in two places.
Appreciate that. Yeah. So I pointed out a blog post about zero trust with Kubernetes with Linkerd, which digs into a lot of this stuff. It's obviously Linkerd specific, but a bunch of concepts in there are useful for talking about security in Kubernetes in general.
Cool. All right. So we're getting close to time. So I have two questions. The first is is Kubernetes expensive, and how do you ensure you're not wasting some resources? Andy, I'm throwing this one to you.
What? Because this is my mantra, my motto, my thing that I say all the time. Set your resource requests. Oh yeah, it probably will be. Set your resource requests and limits properly. The first thing you have to do when you deploy any pod or workload into Kubernetes is say, I need this much resources, and this number is used by the scheduler, which affects auto scaling, which affects bin packing, which affects how where things are run next to each other and whether your cluster is stable or not, and how much things cost in the end. And so if we can get those numbers right, and it's just 4 numbers, then everything will be better in Kubernetes. But it's a hard problem, right? You have application, profiling is difficult. Load testing can be difficult. Identifying really how many resources you need per each pod can be hard, but it is a very important exercise to do. And there's lots of tools out there to help you, open source and paid. Another shameless plug, Goldilocks on the open source side and Insights on the paid side, both projects by Fairwinds that can help you with your resource requests and limits.
And so somebody did say, I assume a good monitoring solution can help with right sizing with limits and requests. I'm not sure about monitoring, but I know Goldilocks and Insights do.
Yeah, I would say monitoring can help.
Yeah.
If you have it monitoring things like your actual resource usage.
Okay.
The way we used to do it before we had the tools was we go look at a graph in Datadog or Prometheus and say, this is where it goes. And these tools do the same thing. They just make it a little bit easier to identify the numbers that you need. So,
okay. One participant said, any concerns one should be worried when the database is on-prem and the Kubernetes cluster is managed by a cloud provider?
Latency.
And egress pricing.
Yeah, egress, traffic pricing, and latency.
Okay.
I'm not sure which of those I'd be more concerned about. That's really interesting to contemplate, right?
Depends on whether you're cost sensitive or not. Not everybody is.
Well, it also depends on even predicting the latency for that is going to be really interesting, right? And so you're pretty much going to have to measure that and see what it's like. And yeah, so that makes it a really, really interesting question to think about.
All right. So, final question before we all do our shameless plugs right at the end. So we talked about our mistakes and some pitfalls at the beginning. So I want to kind of leave on a positive note, which is like, what is one huge success you had with Kubernetes? And like, how did the organization or you do better because, hurrah, it was amazing. And Stevie, do you want to go first on this one?
Success. Gosh, it's much easier to think of the challenges. I always go back to this one because I was new in my Kubernetes journey, and when I got this going, it made me feel really good. Like I actually accomplished something and learned something, and that was a company I worked for. They were using Prometheus, but they were using it as it just fell over all the time, because anyone that knows Prometheus knows it's like a big memory hog, and that it will eat every bit of memory you have. And so we were constantly being like, oh yeah, this thing is going wrong. Let's look at the metrics. Let's look at this. Oh, Prometheus is down. And having that happen. So I dubbed myself the monitoring person, and went and learned everything I could about Prometheus and came up with, some solutions to kind of split our Prometheus instances out a little bit, like to federate it some, to have it gathering important metrics from the different teams so that they had steady instances that they could go to look at metrics for their, for their concerns, but then also an aggregated layer that then infra folks could use to look at the stuff from those other instances that were important on an infra scale, and essentially managed to have a working stable monitoring solution in place. And then I made all the pretty graphs and things, which were very cool. And so I felt very proud about that project. And I think the good thing for the company was that, we had reliable monitoring. We had Alert Manager going. So we knew that if something was going wrong, we would actually know about it, and not have to wait to try and actually access monitoring. Like, oh crap, this has been down for how long? So that's my triumph, I guess.
All right.
One of the most
Andy.
terrifying questions to ask ever. This has been down for how long?
Right.
Right? Oh, gosh.
What do you mean RabbitMQ split brained and we didn't know about it? on top of that.
Oh, now I'm having nightmares. Gosh. Okay. So mine, I will be quick, but we had a customer on the services side of things we worked with for a long time. And I'm not sure if I can actually talk about who they are, but I'll just kind of generalize here. They had essentially an event that they worked towards that was one day a year, and it was the most traffic that they had just massive spike in traffic every year. And every single year before we worked with them, they had an outage, and we helped them build out their Kubernetes platform and get their scaling in place and get to a point where they had their first ever event where they did not have an outage. And that was pretty satisfying. It's like we've actually done all the things with Kubernetes that we were supposed to do, and it did what it was supposed to do, and it scaled, and we supported them, and it was great. So
that was before my time, but that's the stuff of legend. I have heard that story.
Amazing. All right, Flynn, tell us your success.
My favorite Kubernetes thing that I've seen was I don't really get to take a lot of credit for this. This was mostly for the Buoyant team, who's been actually writing Linkerd and all that kind of stuff, right? But we ended up talking with a company that I definitely don't get to say who they are, but I can say that money was involved, like they're a finance type company. They had tried unsuccessfully with a service mesh that shall not be named to get things working for something like 6 months. And they were able to start with Linkerd and have it running in production in 9 days.
That's pretty awesome.
Running and working and having good things like that going. So that was pretty cool.
And working. That's a good.
Working is very important there. Yeah, so that was very cool.
All right, so we have 4 minutes left. So I am going to just share my screen, and Jared's going to set up another poll for us, which is around what is your greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment. And while that plays out, that plays out. I'm not sure how that happened. Anyways, I'm gonna do a little bit about Fairwinds. So for those of you who attended, we provide software for platform engineers running Kubernetes. And Flynn said earlier around standardization, we help you standardize and enable your development best practices, so you can standardize, automate, enforce these best practices. And we do that with our product called Fairwinds Insights. So benefits. You're going to decrease friction between teams, improve your developer experience, which I know is a super hot topic right now, speed up the velocity of deploying apps, and overall, and this is actually from a customer who said this to us, accelerate your time to market and revenue generation, because you will be able to get apps to market faster. And that is not marketing. That is from a customer who said that. So that is Fairwinds in a nutshell, and you can try Insights. You can use it for free forever with your app. So try that out. And then I'm going to pass over to Flynn for your little plug.
Yeah, so I put a link to this in the chat earlier, but you should be able to scan that QR code from your screen. If not, it's learn.buoyant.io, very complex. We just did the certification course. We would love to hear what you think about it. We would love to hear what you'd want to see next, because we're going to be doing more of these. I don't want to give anybody the impression that this is a great Kubernetes 101 kind of course. It's angled more towards service meshes than to Kubernetes. It assumes a certain amount of familiarity with Kubernetes, but it is, I think, a good way to get started and to understand the point of service meshes and what they can help you with.
Awesome. And I just figured out how to use polls, so you're welcome, everyone. And most of you, let's see, the majority of people said improving the security posture of your cluster was your greatest opportunity, followed by getting some help with the basics. Hopefully we helped you out today on that. And then best practices, saving money, and improving reliability all tie. So awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I think Jared's going to pop on and do his final wrap up.
Yeah, I will just take another minute. I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining today's discussion and sharing your expertise with us. Just a quick reminder that today's session was recorded. Following the panel, you'll receive an email to access the recording on demand. You can also go to cloudnative.com or devops.com/webinars. Look in the on-demand section where it'll be waiting for you there. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, I have 4 $25 gift cards. I want to pass those out. We've got Lisa M, Marie L, Ariel P, and Seren K. Congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye out on your inbox to claim your gift card. If you don't see it in your inbox here in the next few minutes, be sure to check your spam. They do show up there sometimes. Again, thank you again for taking the time to be with us. I also want to thank Fairwinds for sponsoring today's program. I also want to thank each of you, our audience, for joining us for the entirety of today's presentation. Please take a moment to fill out the post survey. It should be popping up on your screen here in the next couple seconds as soon as the session closes out. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Much
Thanks, everybody.
appreciated.
Thank you. Bye.